This story regarding Lauren Boebert has been very fascinating, moving from the 3rd Congressional District into the 4th. It is interesting, especially given that she's become a very nationally known name. And so folks everywhere across the country can have some familiarity with Boebert. This is also just a general rarity of somebody moving from one district to another. That's the first topic that I want to hit on before we look back at 2023 and some of the big headlines with Roshini Rajkumar, a good friend of mine who's been on my show as a guest for almost a decade. She is a crisis strategist, a licensed attorney, and the host of the Crisis Files podcast, which is now about to debut its 75th episode. From 2012 to 2021, she hosted Real Talk with Roshini on WCCO Radio in the Twin Cities in Minnesota, and her book, Communicate That, is in its 3rd edition. Roshini Rajkumar joins me now. Good morning, Roshini, and Happy New Year.
Good morning, Jimmy. Great to be with you on this last Friday of the year.
Great to have you on the program for this final Friday. And I would be remiss, because it's been just the talk for days here in Denver, if I didn't get your take, especially as a crisis strategist and as a communications coach, on this decision by our Congresswoman for the 3rd Congressional District in Colorado, Lauren Boebert, to make a switch to the 4th District. Now, she was on with George Brockler yesterday and talked about a couple of her reasons. One being, look, they've been throwing all this dark money at me, and it makes it more difficult for me to win in this district. Number 2, I have some roots in Douglas County because I lived here in my younger days and so forth. Those are a couple of the things. Of course, it seems more like the number 1 was the case. She was probably going to lose. CD4 is more of a Republican district, a solidly Republican district, meaning good chance that if she wins the nomination, there's a primary with several candidates she's jumping into, that she'll win in the general. But what is your take, sort of abstractly, as somebody who doesn't live here, who doesn't know too much about the situation? How do you think of this approach it yourself, but also from the perspective of people who may hear this news out of state?
Well, the obvious accusation of carpetbagging is there for sure. And it really does sound like she's trying to cherry pick where she's going to get those votes. And when these types of things happen with office holders, I am very dismayed, because really they should be looking at their record. What did you do for the people of CD3? Can you just not make a good case anymore that you should be reelected, or the signs are, the writing's on the wall that you're going to lose? Oh, let me go pick another district. I mean, that in itself is pretty disingenuous, unless she's just so popular and has such a great chance in CD4, and there's some overwhelming need to represent the people of Colorado and CD4. It's kind of hard to make a real passionate plea for her case. I mean, I'm just saying that as a non-Coloradan, and also just from the optics of all of this. And she isn't someone who apparently is squeaky clean with the fact that she's made national headlines with some of her different behaviors. So I think it's just going to be interesting to watch. People like you and I, we really do like watching these kinds of antics. It makes the shows fun and interesting. But the people of those 2 districts are really the ones who should call her on whatever she's doing, because they ultimately are the people who are voting.
So there is a very strong primary of several candidates, as I mentioned, that she's jumping into this race for. If you were one of those candidates, what might you contend on the basis of, obviously you're not in Colorado, so you don't have all the information, but what at first brush might be, from a communication standpoint, 1 or 2 of the most effective points in a primary for somebody who, frankly, Lauren Boebert is very popular among the Republican base because she's a America First candidate. She's very close to President Trump, and a lot of Republicans that find that very appealing. So with that in mind, what might you think? Okay, you're running in a primary against Boebert. What might you say?
Well, the other candidates, of course, each of them has to first assess how well known am I, what kind of credibility do I have, even if I go about and attack her. Can I use my own credentials, my own history if I've served in office before? The other main thing is really to use language of manipulation. She sounds like she's manipulating you, people in the fourth, different things like that, so that you sort of put the seed in their mind, the seed of doubt in their mind. So that would be the strategy I would advise any of these other candidates, not fully knowing who they all are and what strengths or weaknesses they have. But that's probably the best way to go. But I always think it's dangerous to point too much at your opposition versus really trying to shine brightly with what you bring to the table. Now, a little different when it comes to a primary, I understand, because you're just trying to win it so that you can stay in it, right? But that's the kind of language that I would use, that language of manipulation. Does she think you're all fools, people, because I'm here to represent you and stay here. I live here. This district means a lot to me. Those kinds of things are the messaging recommendations I would make to those other primary candidates.
Is there anything you think she might make as an appeal to the fourth CD? Hey, you should vote for me. I mean, does it need to come down to, here are the things that I've accomplished, or just I'm a fighter, I've got the right principles, and you should elect me because I know how Congress works and I can keep fighting in there if you put me in the fourth?
Well, principles are an interesting thing because some people go really far with the ethics there. I don't know that she's speaking of ethics. What she can have going in her favor is how much does she want to appeal to keeping the seat, along the lines of a Republican who already has some experience, who knows how to do some of the things, some of the manipulations, sadly, some of the activities of D.C. So that's where, at a time when power in Congress, power in the U.S. Senate, is at different tipping points. So that's really the argument that she has, is to not let it just accidentally, go. We don't want it going to the Democrats. She could say something like that, as well as just her own credentials and experience.
Sure. Roshini Rajkumar joining us, host of the Crisis Files podcast and crisis strategist. I want to shift in to 2023. We are at the end of this year, and in Colorado, obviously, we have this big political story to round out the year, and that's certainly one for the record books. But across the country, we've had so much. I mean, we've got a war in Israel that launched in October when Hamas brutally attacked the Jewish state in the worst, most deadly attack against Jews since the Holocaust. We have the ongoing war in Ukraine, of Ukraine doing its best to push back against Putin, and there's a lot of politics around that. We have a southern border crisis that has deteriorated. There are so many things politically and otherwise to jump into. When you look back at 2023, Roshini, and especially the beginning of the year, if we can even remember that far back with everything that happens, what are one or two things that really stand out?
Well, first I'll give you the big headline. So 2023 was a year of some very sad deaths. Some people that had lived long lives. So we'll get into that in a second. But let's go back to January 2nd, 2023, when Damar Hamlin, a 25-year-old Buffalo Bill, collapses on the field. Fortunately for him, the medical team went into swift motion, got him the attention he needed, and what a miraculous recovery. But what part of that headline shows us, and another one I'll mention, is how much of a hold the NFL and sports and famous athletes have on Americans day to day. So that was definitely a gripping story. At the time, my cousin was in the front office with the Buffalo Bills, so my brother and I were texting him that evening, trying to get any of the behind the scenes that we could. It definitely was something that rocked that whole organization, rocked the NFL, and really many of us who are sports fans were following that story. So that was really huge. And luckily, Damar Hamlin was a healthy man, an athlete, and everything happened in the right order medically for him to survive that. The other real NFL headline to me involves entertainment, and that's the Taylor Swift, the Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce coupling, and just the popularity of them as a couple, how the numbers for the NFL went up for those KC games when Taylor Swift was in the audience. She becomes Person of the Year by Time Magazine, not only because of her relationship, but because of her huge Eras tour and like the huge the multiplier effect that that tour had in all the cities economically. So entertainment, sports, they really have a hold in our country. And I think at a time when politicians are really letting us down, we sort of look to some of those happier stories, Jimmy.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you would highlight those two sports-related stories or sports-specific stories, although I say related because Taylor Swift, of course, is not a sports icon. Well, okay, now she's a sports icon. And in the pop culture, that's a big deal. Now, you mentioned the high-profile deaths by people who have lived long lives. I mean, Henry Kissinger comes to mind as but one example, dying at the age of 100. Tony Bennett, Jimmy Buffett in the music world passed away. Who are some of those standouts who died that you say, okay, these are some of the icons that we lost, and that's a big story?
Well, let's start with Sandra Day O'Connor. So I say this not only because I am a licensed attorney, but even as far, I've been licensed for, I don't know, I can't even remember now. In 1997, I got my license in Minnesota. And even at that time, in the mid to late 90s when I was in law school, Sandra Day O'Connor was thought of as this trailblazer. And that was still a time. Even now, it's like people don't realize, I think, if you're coming of age in the current age, what a big deal it was that she was named the first female Supreme Court justice in the United States. I mean, that was such a big deal. And she was this big motivator. She came from, your part of the country and was such a cowgirl in her heart. And she took that all the way to the Supreme Court. So her death was, I think, very just a time to reflect. That was one. And you mentioned some other big names in politics. I think another one, and it personally rocked me because I kind of, in my formative years after college, grew up with the show Friends. And when Matthew Perry died, that just was so surprising, even though it was no secret that he had addiction issues and major alcohol issues and drug issues. But, he was recovering, he was helping other people. But to have this icon that was so part of the culture of people of, kind of a certain age bracket, maybe spanning about 20 years.
Yeah.
I'm in that bracket. You can't really, how many times do I say things that I think were inspired by his quotes from the show that are just part of my own lexicon, right? So those are some of the big deaths. You mentioned a couple, but Sandra Day and Matthew Perry, for their own unique reasons, were really huge.
Real quick, because I'm just about out of time, as we look ahead to 2024, what do you think folks should be watching for in the new year, early on in the new year, not looking out per se to November?
Well, politics will definitely take a hold of our country. I have said this. I've said it on The Crisis Files, the episode that just dropped today, number 76, called Crystal Balls. I say one of the big headlines in 2024 will be the Hispanic vote and what kind of movement we see there and the Hispanic culture across entertainment and other fields. So to me, that's the big story of 2024. We do have to figure out what's happening in our country. The divisiveness is just terrible. And I really hope that we're going to see some voices of reason come about. So I hold some hope for 2024. And as I always say, not a matter of if but when, crisis will rock your world.
Yes.
So we do want everyone to be preventing crisis in their own lives.
Yeah, and one thing I'm looking forward to early in 2024, being on the Crisis Files with you, Roshini Rajkumar. I'm very much looking forward to that. That'll be coming up soon in the next month. Happy New Year, folks. Check out the Crisis Files podcast on all the podcast platforms. Really appreciate it, Roshini, and we'll talk to you again in 2024.
Thanks, Jimmy. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you.